Some of Australia's largest employers, including banks, could be among 9,000 businesses facing the $3 billion health levy. The federal government has labelled the charge a job killer, but Victoria's Treasurer believes it's appropriate and fair. Joining us live now is independent economist Saul Eslake. Saul, thanks so much for your time once again. We spoke to you earlier in the week about the changes to housing tax, essentially, and now we have this big impost when it comes to payroll tax. This government in Victoria seems to be doing the opposite of what governments around the world, and indeed the federal government, is doing, and that is kind of trying to raise revenue, increase taxes when we're still in the midst of a pandemic. What do you think of that?
Well, it's certainly true that the Victorian government is taking a different approach from the federal government. You could, although the Victorian Treasurer hasn't, characterise the Victorian budget as making a start on the task of budget repair, which the federal government quite consciously and, in my view, properly deferred for a later budget, presumably sometime after the next election. But the Victorian government isn't completely isolated in seeking to raise revenue from business. For example, the Biden administration, a Democratic administration in the United States, does propose to increase the company tax rate from 21%, where Donald Trump cut it to 3 years ago, to 28%. He concedes he might not get the full increase through the Congress, but it is likely that the US company tax rate will rise by at least 4 percentage points. Similarly, the British Conservative government, in its most recent budget, foreshadowed an increase in its company tax rate from 19% to 25%, taking effect next year. So that's quite a significant increase in the company tax rate. And while, as you say, I was critical of the Victorian government for increasing penalties or fines, which it's already a national leader in, and also for increasing the worst form of property tax, stamp duty, as well as increasing land tax without introducing any reform of land tax, I'm less critical of what they're doing with regard to payroll tax. I certainly concede it's a significant increase. I mean, in total, Victoria is raising its payroll tax collections by more than 10% and raising it, as you say, from large businesses. But payroll tax is not, contrary to what's often said, a bad tax in the general scheme of things. It's very similar in the way that it works to the GST, in the sense that payroll tax taxes one of the major differences for a business between the cost of the materials they buy and use to make whatever it is that they're making and selling, and the end sales revenue, that is to say the cost of labour inputs. Well, the GST effectively taxes that plus the profit margin, and it's quite common for business groups to advocate an increase in the GST in order to fund reductions in either personal income tax, which is what the federal Howard government did 20 years ago, or more recently they've advocated increases in the GST in order to pay for reductions in the company tax rate. And an increase in the payroll tax rate is similar to that. Big businesses who make profits will, of course, be able to deduct the increase in payroll tax in Victoria from their company tax bill. So, while it is unambiguously a tax-raising measure, and the fact that the revenue is being put to a good cause in terms of increased investment in mental health services, for which there's a clear need, doesn't diminish the fact that it is a big tax increase, but it's certainly not the worst one that's in the most recent Victorian budget.
Indeed. So if you're a Victorian business, though, would it be cheaper to hire someone who lives in New South Wales rather than Victoria? I totally take that for some small businesses, there's the geographic realities, but is that what it essentially comes down to?
Well, of course, small businesses aren't subject to this increase in payroll tax. Indeed, small businesses aren't subject to payroll tax at all in most jurisdictions. Victoria is a bit less generous to small business than some other states, including New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia are. But there's no evidence that the less generous exemption for small business in Victoria has had any impact on employment creation in Victoria. Indeed, my view is that concessions to small business for payroll tax are a complete waste of money, and state governments would be better advised to abolish those concessions for small business, bearing in mind, of course, that payroll tax is deductible against federal company tax for small businesses, as it is for big ones, and instead give more generous concessions to new businesses. That would be a much more powerful incentive for employment creation and innovation than just simply giving tax breaks to small businesses for no reason other than that they are small. But let's remember also that what Victoria's done in terms of slapping an increased payroll tax on big business is something that the Western Australian Labor government did 4 years ago when it first came to office as a budget repair measure. Now, their measure was temporary. I think it's due to expire next year, but it's not evident that the payroll tax surcharge which the WA government imposed a few years back on big businesses operating in Western Australia had any particularly negative impact on employment by small businesses. And, while in theory it's possible that a large business operating in Victoria and other states could choose to increase employment in those other states, and that may happen to some extent, but I think the effect will be relatively small.
Indeed. We all got a little bit excited when we saw those unemployment figures yesterday. The headline's great, but are you concerned about a few of the underlying issues, underemployment, and of course that feeding into slow wages growth?
No, not really. I mean, you should never make too much of a single month's figure, and this one was, it seems, affected by the coincidence between the week in which the survey was taken and the Easter and school holidays. There was a very big increase in the number of people who were taking leave. That is, they were, as far as they were concerned, employed, but actually working 0 hours. We saw this, of course, happen in a much bigger way in January as well. But the increase in the number of people reporting that they were employed but not working any hours, and not for economic reasons, but for other reasons, that was much larger than in other years, 2015 and 2018, when the April labour force survey coincided with the Easter and school holidays. So I don't think we should read too much into it. At face value, it does seem as though the loss of jobs in the weeks following the termination of JobKeeper, which had been forecast by Treasury perhaps to be in excess of 100, though less than 150,000. The impact hasn't been nearly as big as that, and there's other evidence to support that contention as well, including the decline in the number of people on the job seeker payment over the 4 weeks following the termination of JobKeeper. So, I'm not unduly concerned about this. The unemployment rate fell mainly because of a drop in the number of people participating in the workforce, but we did see further declines in both underemployment and underutilisation of the labour force. So that's an encouraging trend. The other point that's important to understand in this context, Laura, is that because of the closure of our borders, which we're being told is likely to remain until mid-2022 at the earliest, you don't need to create as many jobs as used to be required in order to get the unemployment rate to go down. So, with the working age population now only growing by a bit under 9,000 a month instead of 26 or 27,000 a month as it had been before the onset of the pandemic, you only need to create an average of about 5,500 jobs a month in order to get the unemployment rate to fall, assuming no change in the labour force participation rate. And that's pretty easy to do, especially when you consider one of the other implications of the continued closure of our borders, the ban on Australians travelling overseas. That means that the more than $50 billion per annum that Australians would have been spending overseas if we were a free country is instead being forcibly diverted to spending at home, and quite a significant amount of that has been spent at home, on homes, on cars, on clothing, on cosmetics, even on booze, and that is helping to offset, in fact more than offset, the spending that we're not getting from migrants tourists and foreign students in Australia. It's more than offsetting that. In a sense, the closure of our borders, necessary though it might have been over the last 12 months for health grounds, is increasingly looking like a form of protectionism of the sort that Australia employed from Federation until the late 1980s. We forced Australians to spend money that they might have preferred to spend on imported goods and services, on domestically made goods, and in the short term, that created jobs and had other positive, I suppose, psychological effects in the sense that we were able to call ourselves a manufacturing country. But while we were doing that, we, of course, went from being the richest country in the world, as we were along with New Zealand and Argentina at the time of Federation, to, by the time we realised that this was a pretty dopey idea, being about the 26th richest in the world, and on our way, as Paul Keating famously said, to being a banana republic. In the same way, this de facto protectionism that the continued closure of our borders is in effect creating, despite warnings from health experts like Nick Coatsworth and Brett Sutton that it's ultimately unsustainable, this form of protectionism is temporarily creating jobs and making things look rosier than they are. But the longer we keep up with it, the greater the, I think, ultimate detraction from our living standards over the longer term.
Absolutely, and let's hope it is short-term protectionism too. Saul Eslake, thanks for your time.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Laura.